let's talk about my top 8 fiction books that I read in 2024. 8 rather than 10 books. I read, I think, 42 fiction books in 2024, which is a slight reduction from normal. Different balance of things, some slightly longer books. And I could probably find 10, but I think let's go for the best of the best, the top 20% of the total or something. Top 8. I think 3 of these possibly were rereads actually, so I don't know if that's a terrible judgment on either my reading habits in general or my ability to pick new books. Probably the latter, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. Either way, none of these I think are new releases, so it is very much old books which are rereads, most of which I think I can recommend to you. So this is in no particular order. Lords and Ladies by Terry Pratchett. This was read fairly late in the year. This is a reread, but it's a reread of a Discworld book I didn't strongly remember. I hadn't loved it as much as some other books I had read, some Discworld books I had read at the same time, late 90s, early noughties. I will have enjoyed it. It's a witches book, and in this, the elves invade reality, and it turns out they are like the old fairy tales, not like the new fairy tales or something. They are dark and dangerous and strange. And there's a bunch of reasons actually why this worked better for me. I mean, there's some that these were fairly minor, but the fact you're like, some of the stuff to do with Granny Weatherwax and the elves comes full circle later on, and that stuff I didn't know at the time. Some of the points that are raised here become important later, but that's very minor. I think it's funny, it's clever. Probably there's things, I think there are themes that are more adult in the sense of actually adult, actually mature here. Sensitive, thoughtful, reflective themes, which I didn't appreciate as much then. But it's funny, it's clever. It's not where I'd start Discworld, or not where I'd start The Witches. Start with Equal Rights or Weird Sisters for a series about kind of psychology using witches who do have magic power but prefer not to use it. Or Guards for the downtrodden city guard who are always being killed by adventurers. But it's a very good entry in my Discworld reread. Fifth had a Cerberus. We buddy read this with the slow burn buddy read on my Discord, and this was my first Wolf book. And one reason for a reread was because I'd read it and then I loved it. I thought this was a great book, but I didn't read any Gene Wolfe for a long time because I was just reading kind of whatever. I was reading, going through a lot of SF Masterworks, Gateway, that kind of thing, and this was one that was on the shelf that my friend has a bunch of these, and I took that one. I was like, I'll read that one. And then I read whatever it was, Frederick Pohl, Gateway, and Larry Niven Ringworld. I didn't go back to Wolf at the time. So that means it was kind of fresh because it wasn't part of my big habit of reading Wolf in the last 3 or 4 years, starting with Book of the New Sun. And it's so many of his important later themes and trends are here. This is really his breakout novel. It's his second novel. I think, is it his second or is it his third? I think it's his second. And it's 3 novellas stitched up into one, but it's not a stitch up in the way we often, like where they're loosely linked. They are strongly linked, but they are separate stories. It's very clever. And it's about identity and about what the narrator, we have these narrators and it's not clear what's going on with them. And it's a sci-fi story, and it's actually a sci-fi story. That the facts of sci-fi matter to do with AI and to do with aliens and to do with what might be possible with aliens and what's possible with space travel. And there's some strong aesthetic decisions actually made as well to do with all these things. But it's also, it's much more, in that sense, it's a sort of post-New Wave book that it is about its philosophic themes as well. Much more, some would say. It's got this beautiful early Wolf style. It's very readable stylistically for people who may find some later Wolf dense and intentionally dense, and that's no criticism. I love that style too, but this is very open and voluptuous. I've got a video about it actually, style in Wolf, sentence structure, things like that. Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's also got a mystery. Wolf usually has a mystery, and it has a mystery that a new reader can actually engage with rather than just be like, oh, this is like several books deep in a series, or this is such a knotty, complex set of ideas. This is more like, here are some weird things. You will come to some conclusions about them. So yeah, I recommend that to the uninitiated. Starship Troopers by Heinlein. I thought this was fascinating, and especially it was fascinating to do with media literacy discussion going both ways on the film. But that Heinlein's Starship Troopers is not what the film is, and it's not what the cartoon series is. If you want to have an argument about Starship Troopers media literacy, try to work out how that cartoon series works in. But no, I really enjoyed this. It felt like a really important gap in my reading that I hadn't read much Heinlein other than short stories. And I've got The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, I think, or one other of his books that I haven't read. And what's interesting about this is that Johnny Rico goes to war versus the bugs. And there are occasionally it's a little bit didactic. It is a didactic book. It has things it thinks and wants to say, but mostly does this in a genuinely integrated way. It's things to do with the character and the situation. And it's not really, it has stuff about combat, but a much longer section than anything on any actual combat is the training section. There's a lot of stuff about, and this will reflect some of Heinlein's own experience in the National Guard and in the US Navy, about the unit and about the sense of purpose in what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. And it's an interesting match. It comes, a little before, of course, but it is I-59, whereas I think Forever War is 72, maybe. That's a Vietnam era novel, and that's important. But I think it's an interesting pair with that because Heinlein does not wholly come to the same conclusions as Haldeman. There's some things that are shared actually, but it's an interesting comparison by someone who was in the armed forces, didn't see sort of proper combat. He was sick. He had to retire from the Navy before World War II due to sickness. But is a big part of his life for a long time. So I think that sense of the unit and the sense of, and I think also post World War II when it's written, you can see that he's trying to integrate some of this. And they're both, by the way, both very good novels. And I think it is useful that this gives a fairly coherent argument for what, when you think about sci-fi and war novels, is the other side of what you typically read. This was a reread, not the whole poetical works of Edmund Spenser, but book one of the Fairy Queen, which I've been writing about on my Substack. Which is, I love the Fairy Queen, and it was an interesting reread, partly because I was again like, I'm picking up on so much more than when I first read it a long time ago, really. I mean, I say that like a decade ago, maybe just over. And it's about it's this set of 7 books about various adventures of knights in Fairy, all to do with service to or connected to the Fairy Queen. The Fairy Queen herself is not that important a character, actually. That's not what the books are about, but just that's a framing device. But here, the Red Cross Knight is travelling with Una, and they are off to slay a dragon, the Dragon Era, who has imprisoned Una's parents, who are king and queen. And they go through many troubles. The main thing is actually they're separated fairly early. Red Cross makes some bad decisions and ends up is deceived by another woman and ends up travelling with her and gets into all kinds of problems. And Una, who is pure hearted and good, is trying to get through stuff and find Red Cross as well. And you get a young Prince Arthur, i.e. King Arthur, as a young man in it. That's great. It's an allegory. It's this kind of Renaissance, late medieval allegory, which is a more complicated genre to read, but also easier than some people think. Mostly, you just read it and it's a story, right? It's not like I have to know all this stuff. You can enjoy just the poetry and the imagery and the story itself, and then everything else as you build up knowledge about the stuff. It's there in the background waiting for you. But no, I couldn't recommend it in the same way I'm recommending the other books I'm recommending, because you might not like poetry, and that's the most obvious reason why you shouldn't read it. But I really appreciated it as a fictional narrative that was really satisfying on the whole, and had a lot of beauty in it and a lot of strong images and just some incredible invention, and some really good poetry. So yeah, it's my poetry book of the year, though I guess it's the only long poetry book I finished this year, I think, anyway. This is not actually what I'm recommending. I think my daughter has secreted the Treasure Seekers by E. Nesbit somewhere. This is the sequel, which we also read, The Would Be Goods. I recommend the Treasure Seekers, book 1 of the Bastable trilogy, very highly. It's about some children, 5 children in the first book. There are another 2 in the second. There are sometimes dogs. Usually there's dogs as well. And essentially they cannot help but get in enormous trouble despite being... They mean well. That's why they're the Would Be Goods in book 2. This is them playing the Jungle Book with their uncle's stuff in his garden, which gets them to some trouble in the second book. So yeah, we read it with the kids, read the first 2 books. And it's hard to say with Nesbit. I've only read them. I guess I've read some short stories of mine, but I've only read them with the kids. So how far, it's independent from that experience is debatable. But what is not debatable is that they are, because I read lots of books with the kids and on my own and have done in the past, but is that they are well structured, well plotted. They are funny. They're really funny books. Very well written, and she's very good and adept at different voices and framings in different books. I've also discussed the Samiad trilogy and the Railway Children on this channel, and it's just very funny. And she is able to she has a good touch of being able to turn on the emotion and the sweetness and the just the touching elements. She can do it really ratchet, really hard, and that's particularly obvious in the Railway Children, or more subtly as in the Bastables. So yeah, the new Treasure Seekers. The new Treasure Seekers is the third one. How are we doing? Oh, one is over here that I need to get. I'll pick this one up first, just so I remember it, I guess. Blood Meridium by Cormac McCarthy. This, I definitely had kind of some complex and multifaceted feelings about this. I think I realised this was one of those times. I had a few moments like this with McCarthy, literally 2 different things with McCarthy this year, like this one, like we're talking about media literacy. The sense that people don't get key things going on in McCarthy that are really upfront, and which maybe come up more if you read more McCarthy, but he definitely feels like an author who is highly praised, highly named and famed. Oh, look at this amazing guy. I love this McCarthy novel. Or, whatever. I love the film adaptation of it. But probably struggles to find an audience willing to engage with what he's actually saying. It's not like Gene Wolfe in that way. The Wolfian community is very hardcore and really focused. I think with McCarthy, he's got a bit too much fame to get the audience he wants. Not that it's hard, by the way. I don't mean it's hard to understand. That's actually not what I mean with McCarthy. I think most people reading McCarthy will get most of what's going on in McCarthy if they can cope with the fact it's often quite bleak. And this is definitely very bleak at times. A lot of it is very bleak. But I don't mean that. What I mean is that I think it's exactly the kind of book and writing that lends itself to pretentious readers, people, wrongly pretentious readers who are seeking to justify some other point beyond the text through their pseudo intelligence. But what Blood Meridian is actually about is about the nature of human evil and how we're involved in it, and how it seems impossible to escape from that. There is perhaps something else going on. Perhaps there are other ways of understanding the world. There are other things we can do in the face of human evil, but it is so difficult to, because evil is both inside us and outside us. And as a friend, Simon from the D&D streaming group actually said, there's some sense in this book that once you cross the border, the border is human decency, essentially. Once these cowboys go over the border to go and hunt down Apaches, accompanied by this young kid, they have gone beyond the border of human morality. It's very powerful, very good, very difficult. I definitely took breaks because it was unrelenting, and that's a criticism actually. It's a small criticism, but a criticism was I was like, great, more human evil. That's a surprise. It is famous for a character called the Judge. He is a very well-written, powerful character. Very interesting to talk about and think about what's going on, what McCarthy is saying about this Judge Holden character, who seems to be, an archetypal. He's both articulate and interesting and clever and fascinated by the world, but also seems archetypally and undefeatably evil. This is one I picked up. This is in my top 8 of the year. It's in my top couple of the year probably. I'd have to really think about it, but all these are on a level really. I read this last month, December, with my friend Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads, as one of our buddy reads. We do a couple a year. We didn't do our traditional annual live stream last year, which would have been partly on this, but then it's coming into Christmas. We didn't have the time. I'm sure we will sometime soon though, and I think we talked about reading the next one as well, Pale Ryder. This is the first of Bernard Cornwell's Saxon series, Saxon Stories, or Uhtred, or Last Kingdom, and it's basically about a Northumbrian Saxon from the north, from where I live, of England during the Viking invasions, and he essentially, one way or another, he's raised by Vikings, and and it's significant. He's raised by Vikings, and he's raised as a pagan, as someone who believes in Nordic pantheism, Germanic pantheism, and the Saxons, though they previously believed in Germanic pantheism, do not. They are mostly Christian. Though there is some sense that there's, it's only half conversion so far in many areas, and that will reflect some of the history. And basically, Uhtred is split here between. It's apparent, we find out very early on. This is not a spoiler. This is the premise, that he ends up working with Alfred of Wessex, the King of Wessex, who becomes Alfred the Great, who unites England, defeats the Vikings, and not permanently, but in one sense decisively. England becomes England. It stays England. It becomes something which still genetically, the along with Celtic, the other biggest component is Saxon, Anglo-Saxon, and so it's about that kind of cross section. This guy with these conflicted, difficult loyalties, with famously, not raised by Saxons, and famously very Christian king, and it's about Uhtred's relationship with him, and this is about his childhood, about being raised by Earl Ragnar the Viking, and how that comes about, and it's about how he ends up engaging initially with Alfred. I'll leave it at that without kind of any more serious spoiler. It's got some really good action. It's got some good history, and it's got good atmosphere. But the single best stuff about it, I think, is the way in which the narrator, Uhtred, he's a reliable narrator, I would say. Maybe someone out there disagrees, but he's essentially reliable. But he's reliable in a complex way, which is that he's not always right. That sounds contradictory. What I mean is his value judgments, his reportage, as far as I can tell, is reliable. His value judgments are his, and he's very clear about that. And he sometimes queries his own past value judgments about what he thought when he was young, or at least he opens up the question. He'll sometimes say, I thought at the time that this. And you can tell he's questioning this in his older age. And this applies to so many things. He reflects on how he thinks about religion, or rather, he reflects on the different religious traditions out there. But it's not that there's just an answer he gives you, or even a simple answer he gives at all, but rather that, or the politics, or his relationship with different father figures. Is his ideas of value and what he values. These are all things you're meant to think, okay, this is a guy telling me this stuff, and you, the reader, are allowed to make value judgments which are quite complicated, because the information he gives you is quite complicated, and you're going to maybe disagree with him. And that is an incredible narrative achievement, a rare one, I would say, in fact. So yes, Last Kingdom, Bernard Cornwell. And then Latro in the Mist, or rather Soldier of the Mist, the first Latro book by Gene Wolfe. This was the other Wolfe book I read. I think maybe I only read 2 in the year. I started the second book, Soldier of Arete, And Soldier in the Mist is about a mercenary who's fought for the Persian Emperor's army, who has lost his memory after a head injury and is captured by the Greeks after Plataea. Is that 479? Is that Plataea? And it's about he records what he does each day so he can read back and remember, and so you get his narrative of what he can remember from the previous day. Each morning he writes what's happened the previous day, or each night and each morning he writes what's happened. And it's classically Woolfian in terms of it's a picaresque of someone wandering around lots of places. It's classically Woolfian in terms of it deals with memory and recollection and narrative retelling. All these things that are very normal, typical Woolfian things. And it's also, it's about this kind of group of people he gathers around himself. It's about him trying to make good decisions when he doesn't always know what's going on. He doesn't know who he is other than what he's written down, and some very faint sense of, maybe I remember what my mother and father looked like, but I don't remember what they're called or what they ever said. Things like that, there's a lot of kind of interesting. This comes up, by the way, in things like The Wizard Knight in Book of the New Sun and elsewhere. And it was a really good read and really interesting, very different to Fifth Head of Cerberus. Fifth Head of Cerberus is also about memory and identity, of course. But for Woolf, it's got a lot of action, some fighting, and he doesn't often write fighting as much as you think he might, given he does lots of actiony, picaresque books. But it's got some good fighting in it. It's got some very good kind of interactions. It's got an unveiling mystery or set of mysteries, which you as the reader sometimes know more about than Latro, because you're like, I can see the things he keeps repeating, or the fact that this doesn't quite reconcile with this other thing. That he is like, oh, I don't know how this happened, but you're like, I think I know, because I think you gave me a clue a few days ago, and that's just really interesting. It's a really fun and exciting book in that way, and I think, I think it's really satisfying. It's also sometimes seen as a really hard Wolf book, or these books are. It wasn't super. I actually think Book of the New Sun is probably harder than Latro. I think it's different. If you're into Wolf stuff and you're wondering, should I read this? I think it's a different kind of challenge to something like Book of the New Sun. I think in some ways it is easier. I don't know if it's my book of the year. It's coming last on this list. It was definitely, again, I've talked about 8 and maybe all later in the top couple, but I think this one might just about scrape it. But The Last Kingdom or Starship Troopers, particularly, or Fifth Head of Cerberus, or Lords and Ladies, they're all very, very good. I'd recommend all of these. I'd recommend Starship Troopers, Last Kingdom, Blood Meridian, Soldier in the Mist, Fifth Head of Cerberus, and Treasure Seekers. I'd say any of those are ones you can dive into. Fairy Queen is more specialised and you may not enjoy, because it's poetry. So, if you like poetry, dive in. Just read it as well. Don't try to understand it all. It's like reading a Wolf novel for Wolfians. And Lords and Ladies, I'd start earlier in the series. Anyway, what were your books of the year, fiction books of the year? Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you next time.